want to break promises. I don't want to hurt you, but I need to breathe. The end of it all is still my best friend. There's something inside that I need to believe. Which way is right? Which way is wrong? How do I say that I need to move on? You know we're heading separate ways.
Alan and I have known each other nearly 40 years. We met, I think, in March 1976 when I was doing my MA thesis on the 1959 intake of the Royal College of Art, which included David Hockney, R.B. Kittai, Derek Bosher, Peter Phillips, and Alan. Alan was regarded as one of the more troublesome students in a very troublesome year because they were too independent-minded. They went on to become founding fathers of British pop art, and they all had quite independent ideas about what kind of paintings they wanted to make. Alan was actually expelled at the end of that year, which could have been a traumatic experience, but it was the making of him, I think, because it proved to the world that he had his own mind. He wasn't going to just do what the staff told him to do. He was actually a very, very serious artist from that very early age, looking in particular at early 20th century modernist painting. His heroes at that time were Robert Delaunay, Wassily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, and those artists and others, including Matisse, Alexander Calder, Picasso, have all continued to fuel his imagination. So although he's very much associated with that pop decade in the 1960s, the work that you see on the walls here, which starts in 1980 and goes up to 2012, shows that he's much more embedded really within the history of painting, the history of European painting, and the history of 20th century painting. Considering that he's an Englishman, it's remarkable how strong a colorist he is, because that's not something one tends to associate with English artists. It's much more of a French tradition. And he uses color in an incredibly inventive and daring way, where a lot of artists would prefer to make paintings around a single color. Monochrome has been a very major feature of painting over the last half century. Alan has always tried to incorporate as many colors as he can within the single canvas because he sees that as much more of a challenge. One tends to think of Alan's work in terms of the imagery. The imagery is very strong, very bold, centered on the human figure, often on the female figure, often with erotic overtones. That has sometimes got him into trouble. Some of the more extreme works, the furniture sculptures he made in 1969, have become notorious. His most celebrated works, and also the most attacked, because of the extreme way in which he incorporated fetishist illustration techniques within that form of sculpture, which was kind of hyper-realist but very exaggerated. By the time of the paintings you see here, 1980, the work had become more lyrical, less confrontational, but still centered very much on the human figure. I would say that there are various ways in which Alan has approached painting, one of which is painting as spectacle. So every picture has a very strong image which attracts you first and brings you into the sphere of the painting. There's an element of painting as performance, and often in his choice of imagery, in the subject matter itself. So we have here a painting of a magician, which is a part of a group of works. There are many paintings of dancers, of musicians, figures on the stage, as you see there. things that are literally impossible, like the way that this female figure is floating in the air upside down, but that are about the artistic imagination and what one can make possible on the canvas. For many years, Alan was known primarily as a painter, but also as a great draftsman and as a very important and significant printmaker, one of the rare artists for whom graphic work is not just something to be done occasionally on the side, but a major focus of investigation. When, in the mid-60s, Alan was discovering that what he wanted to do was to challenge all the assumptions about what painting should be, what its formal qualities should be, one of the main restrictions at that time was that everything should be flat. One should respect the flatness of the support. And he decided when he was living in New York in 1965 that what he had to do was to challenge all those assumptions and to go back to what painting had always done, which is to deal with illusion, with space, with different ways of making you feel that you're in that space. And so part of that investigation led him to making his first sculptures. He began to produce paintings that looked more and more volumetric. And from that, it seemed sensible and inevitable to him to start building that space out into 3 dimensions. So there are paintings like Curious Woman, which he did in 1964, which have elements in relief on the plywood support. By 1965, he was making totemic figures that were very abstracted, but that were still recognizable as figures and that were meant to be experienced in the round. By the early 1980s, when he was commissioned to make a large sculpture for the Liverpool Garden Festival, working in 3 dimensions began to interest him as much as painting. And it has got to the point now where a lot of people think of Alan more as a sculptor even than as a painter. I think he's both, in the way that Matisse was both and Picasso was both. There are not that many artists who feel comfortable dealing both in 2 and 3 dimensions and in exploring the relationship between the two. So this sculpture that's hanging over us here, which was a first trial towards a sculpture to be sited in a public building in East London, takes its cue partly from Matisse's late cutouts from the blue nudes, but reshapes it into 3 dimensions. So although he's working within a framework that one recognizes if one knows about 20th century art, he's always adding his own personality, his own vision to it. I think considering that we've got work spanning 32 years in this one room and not very many works, it's remarkably coherent, his vision, and he found that vision very early on and has never been distracted away from it by fashions in art. He's stuck to his principles. He's made work that's very joyous, very life-affirming, very celebratory, that doesn't need a whole volume of theory to explain it, that anyone coming to it off the street can get some pleasure from and relate it to their own lives. So I'll stop there. And Alan is here, which is a great privilege for all of us. And I'm sure we'll speak to you privately later. And I won't ask him to give a speech because I know he hates doing it.
I have to sing for my supper here, I see.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know how I came to meet Gunther first, but he purchased a set of my furniture sculptures, and I was invited to come for the weekend and see it in situ. I then had just moved back from America and was living with a woman that was soon to be my wife, but she was working, had her own work in the music industry, and said, "Oh, I can't go this weekend." And anyway, I arrived at the Palace Hotel to find that there was no reservation in the name of Jones. And I thought, here we go, I come a long way for nothing here. And so I said, well, in the end, I had to drop the name. I said I'd been invited by Mr. Sachs. So he said, "Oh, wait a minute." You know, looked down. And he said, "Oh, you're in the penthouse." And so for me, those days, I think it was the first time I ever went to a penthouse with an exclusive lift. Only went to there. So the doors opened and the apartment was a wonderland itself, apart from the view out of the window, which was pure. I thought it was sort of out of some Walt Disney film. It was Wonderland, Winter Wonderland, and the bathroom was enamelled by Roy Lichtenstein and Tom Wesselman. And the thing that I remember telling Matthias last night was that the one thing I really remembered above all was that there was a sheet of glass, very strong, bulletproof, strong glass, as a partition between the hallway and part of the room, was my memory of it. And there were these bullet holes in it, all over it, which of course didn't pierce the glass. And when you look closely, there was a little name engraved under each impact point. And the one I remember, of course, was Giovanni Agnelli, and there, no doubt they were all people that he was good friends with. And I thought it was a very novel way of marking your friendship with someone, was to invite them to shoot at you in your own front room. But the evening was very memorable, and we all have memorable stories, but I think I'll leave it at that.
Have a drink.